extremely pleased to introduce our first speaker tonight, Professor James Landay. We've been waiting for you here at Stanford for some time and are just thrilled that this is Professor Landay's first quarter here at Stanford. He comes by way of Intel, Microsoft, University of Washington, Cornell's NYU campus, and an involvement at Tsinghua University in setting up what's called the World Lab, in which they're looking at the interface of design and technology. And his particular interests have to do with human-machine interaction as it's brought together to activate, inspire, and maintain personal change. So with that, Professor Landay, we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So I'm happy to be here. As was mentioned, I'm brand new to Stanford. I'm still counting in weeks at this point, about 12 weeks. But as was mentioned, I've been lucky to have been around many different research environments, and I've been really impressed with what I've seen here so far. What I'm going to describe is several projects that I've carried out with graduate students as well as researchers at a variety of different places, including the University of Washington, where I was last for a number of years, Intel Research, where I ran a research lab in Seattle, as well as at Microsoft Research in Beijing, where I did a long sabbatical a few years ago. And in fact, that sabbatical, where we lived in China for 2.5 years, was very impactful on my research agenda, as well as my life and my view of the world. It was very important for us, because if you visit China right now, you feel like you're at this really important time in history there, where there's lots of change as well as lots of ambition. But it's also interesting that in terms of the Chinese view of the world, it's just a small blip on a very long history, a 5,000-year history. And one thing that was interesting to me was how different stories and idioms actually join the culture of how people think and work in business and in research. So I'm going to start off with one story from China and show you how that's kind of affected how I think about my research a bit. So this is the bronze galloping horse. It's one of the most famous cultural relics in China. It's about 2,000 years old, from the Han Dynasty. It was only uncovered in 1969. And it actually baffled the scholars for several years, because this solid bronze statue is about this large, but what you'll see is it represents this flying, galloping steed, because the story was that the horses in the west of China were so fast that they literally flew. It's a little hard to make out here, but this is actually a swallow that's looking up in horror, kind of as it's being stampeded in the air by this flying horse. And after it was uncovered, the experts who were studying it really were unsure of how, with the technology of the day, did they sculpt this to be solid bronze and not fall over with this very small base. And actually, if you see the real horse, it's not very symmetrical in any way. Now, it's possible that they just cast hundreds of them until they got one that worked. It was surprising to me. I tried to actually buy one of these in China. There's replicas everywhere, and they all have little hacks to make it so it stands up. Either the base is very large, or there's a hole under the horse, and they've stuck weights inside to kind of make it work out after the fact. So it was kind of interesting. But what's also interesting to me is that this horse itself represents balance. It's balance between the artistry of the day and the technology and science to somehow calculate the center of mass and how to make this. And this idea of balance between this kind of art or design and technology, I think, is important in making new products that are going to be desirable to people in the future. So a lot of the research that I do tries to take a look at both of these. So we try to look at both design and technology and how we put them together. So we have these very human-centered approaches and computer science-centered approaches that we combine. At the same time, my time in China has led me to believe that if we're looking to innovate and do new things, it's often important to look at this in a cross-cultural way, that by looking at things from a different culture, we can come up with new ideas faster if we only see our own. So in fact, in a lot of my work, I've tried to look at, what's the difference between an Eastern or Western view, for example, and how that might affect design. So what I'm going to share with you is two different domain areas where we've done research and where we try to find a balance. So in the first is balance with our own environment. So here is an image of Lake Mead. What you should notice is the water level is quite low. We've seen a lot of this across the West over the last few years, but it's a problem in many states in the United States. 36 U.S. states are expected to face severe water shortages over the next 3 to 5 years. Many of you are aware of this, especially living here in Northern California, where we've had a drought. I wasn't really aware of this kind of long-standing problem, though, also in China until I was living there. So this was while I was living in China. The water shortage in Beijing was so severe that they were literally taking snow and melting it. They couldn't wait for it to melt to get water. And in fact, one of the largest construction projects in the world is a major water diversion project taking water from the south of China to the north, which is traditionally dry where Beijing is. It's actually like a 100-year project. It was first proposed by Mao in the early 50s, and the first water just recently started arriving in Beijing, but the project's not supposed to be over until something like 2040. So for me, as a researcher, I have felt that a lot of these problems we face in the world, for example, environmental degradation, are fairly long-term problems, yet a lot of what's done in research these days is oriented towards what can we solve today, or what can we get in our next grant proposal, or what can we publish in our next paper. So as a researcher, I've been trying to advocate folks, especially in my own field, to try to make more audacious goals and try to drive towards them over a longer period of time. So in this particular area of the environment, one area that I've been interested in is, how might we cut a family's water and energy use by 50%? You might just say, give me a couple $1 million, or maybe here in Palo Alto, $4 million, and we'll build a house and we'll make it, fully sustainable. But more interesting to me might be, what do we do with $5,000 or $10,000 with existing homes and existing people's habits? How might we encourage more sustainability in terms of their energy or water use? Now, to me, this is really a problem that has three major components to it. One is really a policy aspect. If we tax carbon, or we tax oil properly, or whatnot, we might have a lot of change there. As a technologist, I'm interested in those, but it's not particularly where I play. So I'm going to talk mainly about what we might do with respect to technologies, and also with respect to how we use design as a way of changing behavior here. So one project that was carried out at the University of Washington is called HydroSense. This was led by a graduate student who was working with me, John Froelich, who's now a professor at the University of Maryland, and Shweta Patel, another professor at UW, and James Fogarty, And the basic idea of this project was to notice that your water pipe network in your home is almost like an information network. It's almost like a communications network. And the idea is that anytime you were to open any faucet or valve in your home, that actually sends information through the pipes. And the information that it sends is actually a pressure wave. And you could measure that pressure wave very inexpensively at one spot, let's say the spigot of your hot water heater, or outside on one of the spigots, or more commonly these days under the kitchen sink. And using that one sensor, you could tell where was the water being used and approximately how much water. And this really led to an innovation that led to water sensing at a factor of 10 or more cheaper or less expensive than previous technologies. So here's the basic idea in action. You see these waveforms represent a faucet, a toilet, and a tub in a home. And what I want you to just notice is this is an open event. So you see this little spike down there. And then here's the close on that valve. And then in the middle here is a toilet and then a tub opening. And the key to notice is just those waveforms look different. And in fact, even if it's the same kind of faucet, let's say you have two bathrooms and they have the same Kohler faucets, you will actually see a different signal just because it's going through the network of pipes, and that signal is being attenuated in a different way. So with some simple processing machine learning, we can actually tell with over 95% probability correctly what is the valve that's opening, and then approximately how much water is being used, really inexpensively. So this actually led to a startup company that these folks did that was eventually bought by Belkin, which makes a lot of add-ons for iPhones and other home networking gear. And so here's the Belkin Echo. You simply put this in with the hose under your kitchen sink, plug in this little Bluetooth computing module there, and you can tell where the water is being used. So to me, that's the technology in this particular domain. More interesting to me was how do we use that technology in a way, along with design, to change people's behavior. So that's kind of where my interest in this lies. So for example, every year at the Consumer Electronics Show, you'll see some company putting forward the smart fridge. And every year I get to use this in my undergraduate class to say, is this a Hall of Fame or Hall of Shame user interface idea, and see what they say. We're finally getting close to where it might actually be useful, but it's pretty much a Hall of Shame. Very few people have a real need for the smart fridge to tell you, hey, you need milk. Usually you just go, hey, we're out of milk. Somebody pick it up later. It's not an emergency. But hey, I thought, wait, I could take over that display on those smart fridges and actually put something useful there. What I would call an ambient feedback display or an ambient display. The idea being that every time you open the fridge or walk by, you might glance at that display and we could somehow change your consciousness of that information that we want you to know about. So John Freilich, as part of his PhD, actually designed over 100 different ambient displays looking at water usage in the home. And he actually tested these in a large online study with hundreds of people to try to understand this design space, to understand, do people really want very quantitative, like graph metrics, or things that were more visual in other ways, and what were some of the privacy issues of, like, Johnny's using a lot of water in that upstairs bathroom. Is that okay for us to reveal that it's Johnny's bathroom, or would that cause tension in the family? And we found different reactions depending on who you were. So we tested a lot of these displays for a lot of these issues in this work. I'm just going to show you a couple in more detail to give you an idea of some of the benefits as well as some of the problems in trying to design for this space. So this is one that we call the aquatic ecosystem. So it might start out like this, and we've sped it up in terms of time, but you might have some kind of water saving goal for your home, and you have this fish, Frank, and you have this tractor there on the left kind of showing you if you've met your goal, and it might go over time. And we sped it up. So Frank met his goal, so he gets to meet his mate, and let's say they do it again, they have some guppies, and so on. Eventually we have a whole fish tank, or we might have a water wheel down here, or whatever kind of nice things you like to have in your aquarium. John also made it touch sensitive so that you can play with it and the fish kind of swim away. So that's one such design that we have. What do you know? People with kids kind of like that design. It was a little more playful. One of the problems with it is it doesn't really give you a lot about where you're using the water. It's more of just, it would be kind of similar to if you just had a number. This design here called Rain Flow tried to get more at kind of what were the activities behind the water. So in this design, John actually put it particularly in something that also had the news and the weather, and then some kind of display of total water over time, and then the date and time. Again, the idea to cause you to want to glance at this for other reasons, and then maybe you're going to also take in this other information. So in this case, these different categories are kind of showing you where the water use is, again, sped up over time, real display. Maybe you have a goal that's based on the height of these different tanks, and then over time you might see where you are with respect to your goal. So in this case, again, he made it a little interactive. This is the programmer at play just trying to show what they can do. But let's say this is your display, and we see that the toileting water there goes over, so it kind of spills over and turns red. Okay. Now, John did a lot of other work, eventually wrote his PhD dissertation, never got to the point, though, besides these online studies and going into a few homes and doing more qualitative feedback, did not get to the point of, let's say, doing a year-long field study where we really controlled for the kind of feedback to see what kind of behavior change you could get. And that's really the next step in this work. At the time, it was hard with very prototype hardware. Now that the Belkin product's out, it might be a lot easier to run this study. And you might find out a lot of things. So, for example, this might seem like a good design, but in my home, my kids might want to be flushing that toilet to see it turn into something like that. We don't really know until you really study it with people in situ. You can show this to people on the web or have them come into your lab, but that's not the same as seeing whether it actually changes behavior in the way that you might want to do. In another kind of study in this vein, Kate Everett, who did her PhD with me, had the idea of kind of studying more of a large table interface where a family would actually come into some place to run this, figuring people didn't have these tables yet at home, but maybe they will eventually, like in a library or something like this. And they would see their energy and water usage for both electricity and gas and things like this, as well as we had transportation for the car. And then they could make shared goals with it by changing the height of these plugs and looking for ways to change their behavior. So that's another way of kind of bringing people into their data to visualize it in real time. So the one I did on that also was transportation. So we actually did a larger project in this space. Again, John was the first author, John Freilich, on this. This was called the UB Green Transportation Display. And the basic idea of this interface was to say, every day, people pull their phones out of their pocket about 100 to 200 times a day. Whether it's to check the time, to send an SMS, to play Angry Birds, check the calendar, whatever it is, about 100 to 200 times a day, people are just pulling out their phone, unlocking it, and then doing something. The basic idea here came out of some earlier work by Sonny Consalvo, who I'll talk about in a minute, was could we change the background display on the phone such that when it came up, you would see some display. So in this case, we were trying to encourage green transportation behavior. So every time somebody engaged in a bit of green transportation, this tree would grow leaves as it went across, eventually these blossoms. And it would show you the last kind of green transportation here. So in this case, carpooling. We wanted to know if people were carpooling or riding their bike or walking, taking public transit like a bus or train. And the problem with this kind of design was, although 80% of the people we spoke to in a survey said, yes, I would like to improve my transit behavior, be more green, when you actually did a study where we actually had people report on every trip they took, as they took them, I would ask them a survey using ESM study saying, why did you use this mode of transportation? We saw you just took the bus, or we saw you just drove your car. Being green was 5th or 6th on the list. Much more common were things like how much money did I save, or how fast was it, or how convenient, or was it calming, or could I get exercise while I did it, or could I read or get other work done. So in this display, we actually tried to show at least those ones that correlate with being green. So saving money, or like let's say you take the bus or the train, maybe it's more calming than trying to fight your way across the Bay Bridge, or you ride your bike and get exercise, or maybe in public transit you can get some work done. And so in this case, if you meet your goal for the week, eventually these fruit would appear. So, and then after the week ended, it would start over like this. We also built another display because my colleagues who we worked on with this at Carnegie Mellon, Jen Mankoff and her students, had a theory that people would bond with animals a little more. So we wanted to look at a display that involved nature in some way. So in this case, you got a polar bear that starts out on a little iceberg, and as you engage in green activity, the iceberg grows bigger, gets a mate, then they have little polar bears, and you get all this fish and seabirds and things like that. And then this one, when you meet your goal, the northern lights come out. So when we built these displays, they're originally just meant to be information that you could glance at and kind of understand what was going on. One of the ideas was we didn't want them to be numbers so that other people didn't necessarily know what was going on with your information if they saw your phone. We also wanted it to be a little fun. But it was mainly about this information communication. When we ran a pilot study with 12 people, half in Pittsburgh and half in Seattle, for this design, we had some good things happen. One is several people wanted to keep using the system. And when you're doing research level hardware and software, if people actually want to keep using it, that's often a good sign, because often it's pretty clunky. And in fact, when we ran that study, those phones that 2 years before that were like the best phones you could get, in the meantime, the iPhone had come out and they had become pretty clunky phones. And people were like, didn't really even like the phones, but they liked the system, wanted to keep using it. I put in quotes here, we saw some behavior change because a 4-week study is not long enough to be able to tell that. But there were kind of some very bad, let's say, habits of people, especially in Pittsburgh, in terms of driving half a mile or a mile to their friend's house and things like this, and they changed that behavior. They became more aware of what was going on. But more important was the result that was not what we were looking for in the study, was qualitative feedback from several of the people who said, oh, I really like the game. Or I would be at work and somebody asked me, what's going on with the bear story now? And they wanted to see it. And we said, what game or what story? We didn't design it as that. But people saw it, even this very simplistic, you just kind of have this display that's changing in a kind of almost linear way as you go. People found it as a story or game. And that's kind of an interesting result that we wanted to use in later designs, was to say you could use a story or a simple story as a way to maybe drive longer term engagement in these systems, because we've built a number of others. And one of the problems is they seem novel at the beginning, people are engaged, but if you were running some of these things for 3 months, and you saw what happens when you finally meet your goal, the northern lights come out or whatever, after a while it gets kind of old. You can imagine even user contributed authoring simple visual displays, and you just subscribe to it. You don't know what's going to happen, and you're engaged just to find out. For example, the driving game or the mountain climbing game. You know the theme, but you don't know what happens exactly. So that's one nice thing that came out of that. As I mentioned, I spent these 2.5 years in China, and one of the first talks that I saw at Microsoft's research lab there was from a researcher from Japan who gave a talk where he showed a bunch of these feedback systems his group had built, and they were using very similar kind of displays to the ones we had already published at the University of Washington and Intel. And in fact, he said, there's these people at the University of Washington and Intel making these feedback systems, but they're not really appropriate for Asian society. And he said the reason was they all use positive feedback. And he said everyone in Asia knows you need negative feedback. And I raised my hand. He didn't know who I was. And I said, do you have evidence of this? And he said, no, but everyone knows. So to me, that was an interesting research question. I really scoured the literature. I knew, and some researchers there who were doing cross-cultural work, and we really couldn't find much to back this up except for some mid-'80s Japanese U.S. cross-cultural work that was going on at the time that had mainly to do with giving feedback to employees and how they might react. So this led to kind of a first study in this area for us to see if there was difference, or at least whether we had more evidence that there might be a difference. So we did an online study with 180 Chinese and Americans over 3 weeks. And in this study, we were again trying to look at environmental behavior change. So over 3 weeks, we had them fill out a standard carbon calculator, like one you would get from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And then we gave them feedback on how they were doing, except we manipulated that feedback to be positive or negative in how we described it. And again, half the people were Chinese and half American, or they were into 2 groups. And then people would make pledges on behaviors that they would change to improve based on suggestions that we gave them. And then later they would report back on how they did. Okay. Now this study has several flaws. One, it's based on self-report. Okay, so we don't really know how their behavior changed. We only know what they told us. So there could be, some confounds in that. Also, again, it's only over a few weeks, so it's not a long-term behavior change. So take the results here with a grain of salt, but they lead me to believe there's something interesting here. So again, we thought positive feedback was the right way to go, and it was based in the literature that we had read about behavior change, and so that's why all the interfaces we had designed were mainly based on when you do the good behavior, we show you some nice feedback, but negative behavior, we wouldn't make the tree die or anything like this. Though other research would lead you to believe you want to do a little, but maybe not a lot. So what do we know? The negative feedback did have a larger impact on the Chinese participants. It was a statistically significant difference that the negative impact led to more, at least self-reported behavior change. The American situation was the opposite, though that result's not statistical. So I really think this is an important area for deeper study. For example, I'd like to really do a deployment of those water interfaces with different interfaces in the U.S. and China over 6 months or a year, and see, do we see a difference in behavior with the style of feedback? in the end, I suspect a more complex feedback strategy that combines that might be even more appropriate, but that would be the first way to go. So this was what we did so far in environmental. The other area that I want to give you a flavor for is really another area of balance, which I think is at the root of a lot of problems we have. This is the balance between eating and exercise. So what you see right here is a map of the United States that comes from the Center for Disease Control. And this is 1990, and each state is colored by the percentage of the population whose BMI is greater than 30. And 30 is the rate where you say that someone is clinically obese. That's where you start to get correlations with heart disease and cancer and other issues like diabetes. What you can see is in 1990, for the states they had data, the ones in gray they had no data for, almost every state is in either 10 to 15% of the population have BMI over 30 or less than 10%. Okay? Now what I'm going to show you here, I think most people already know what's going to happen, but for me what was really interesting is how quickly this happened. As we flip through the 90s, we can see the colors start to get more towards the orange. You know, the South leads us here, Mississippi leading at something. Colorado, hey, that's the place to be if you want to be fit, I guess. But eventually everyone turns to a shade of orange, and again, leading down there in Mississippi. And as we move on, the last year of data with this methodology uses 2010. And at this point, what you see is 12 states have 30% of their population that are clinically obese, 24 in the 25 to 30%, 14 are 20 to 25. And at this point, essentially population over the US, it's about a third of the people. And you might just say, is this just some sign of the baby boom aging and we gain weight like I am? Or is it something else? If you look actually at childhood obesity rates, they followed this at the same time. But just last year we had a result that looks like that might have leveled off, but that result's still controversial, but it would be good if it stopped. What surprised me again is this obesity epidemic that we have seems to be being exported to the rest of the world. So when I was living in China, I was very interested to see this headline about more than 7% of Chinese children were clinically obese. They claim that was second to the US. This came from the Chinese National Task Force on Childhood Obesity, which I wouldn't take necessarily as serious as the Center for Disease Control, but there's definitely some issue you see with middle class boys, especially, and the cultural reason of as they gain income, a lot of people show this externally through eating more expensive food and food that's worse for you. So here you see this is kind of like a weight loss camp in Shanghai that has like a military theme where they work them really hard. So what might a goal be here? I've done some work in how do you log eating in better ways, but one we did a lot of work on was how do we increase physical activity. So again, a very audacious goal might be how do we increase physical activity by 100%, or how do we get back to those 1990 BMI numbers? Again, there are a lot of factors here. There's policy factors, like everyone knows about subsidies for corn and corn sugar and where it is in our food. That could be one of the factors. Another factor could be, in terms of people being fearful about their children playing outside unsupervised. So there's a lot more kind of indoor time and less outdoors, at least when I was growing up. There could be things having to do with video games. We don't know exactly which one piece it is, and it's probably a combination of those. And again, policy, how you build cities, how you make them walkable versus where you have to drive everywhere. These all have major factors. I could reach this goal right here by just telling you, move to Manhattan. I guarantee you'll probably double your step count. I can tell you from moving here, I've not quite dropped in half, but it's different. So how might we do something there? One thing we did a lot of at Intel was how could we design technology that could automatically track people's behavior in terms of their exercise and give them feedback on behaviors they're trying to change. So you've seen, I think, a lot of this in the commercial world now, but I think we were really the ones who did this in a major way first. So this was called UbiFit, and it was a system that had two pieces of it. And this was Sunny Consalvo's PhD dissertation at UW, but also she worked at Intel. She's now at Google. And the basic idea, again, Sunny had was as you glance at your phone during the day, if we took over the background screen and started with this green grass, as you engage in different physical activities, it would grow these flowers. So if you walk 10 minutes or more, a sunflower would grow. If you did 30 minutes of aerobic activity, one of these pink flowers would grow, and the other two are strength training and stretching. And we also built this thing at Intel called the mobile sensing platform. This was really a computer about the size of a pager or one of these microphones that you would clip on a belt. Had 10 different sensors in it. It could sense 3 different kinds of light, accelerometer, barometric pressure, etc. We threw everything at it. Had its own processor, storage, and communication. Because at the time, something like 2008, these kind of phones, 2007, could barely just run the graphics and show your calendar or do email, let alone do machine learning right there on the device. So we weren't thinking the future would be a lot of kind of geeky people walking around with those things strapped to their belt. We knew eventually it would all be built in, but as computer scientists, the way to explore the future is to invent it now with what technologies we have, even though we know eventually they'll be cheaper, faster, and smaller. So over the week, your flower garden grows like this, and if you meet your goal, this butterfly would appear. And again, the idea is not that someone would count their flowers and go, oh, I have 3 this week. The idea is if at the end of the week, you're looking like this, you feel good about what you've been doing. And if it gets towards the end of the week and you're looking like this, you might feel, I should take my gym bag today to work and not go to lunch, or I'm going to ride my bike instead of taking my car and try to increase your exercise. That was the basic idea. The technology behind all this was essentially collecting these sensor readings from this device, doing machine learning on it to figure out what was going on, and then sending those to the phone, which could then figure out what it meant for the particular application. So smoothing that means this device would 3 times per second say, I think you're walking, running, walking. And then this device would go, okay, I think that means walking. Okay, but if we had a different application, we might want to, in real time, change the display or some other thing. But for this, we want to smooth it out over, minutes. And then the phone would do that. Now again, as soon as smartphones that were good enough came out, so the first Android phone, the first iPhone, students working with me and James Slovey showed that you could get 95% accuracy doing this just with the accelerometer on the phone. The latest thing is the Microsoft Band, which is this I'm wearing right here. Scott's opponents who did that worked on this at Microsoft. This device has the same amount of sensing and computation as that big black box that was on my hip in the other picture had. So, what were the surprising results here? We thought that activity inference was the key feature. In fact, as the head of the research lab running Intel Research Seattle, I probably spent a lot of money on a lot of hardware engineering, a lot of machine learning to try to build this device that could figure out what you're doing, and it's still one of the best done today. We can tell if you're walking, running, biking, on a Stairmaster, on an elliptical trainer, or going upstairs. In fact, most of these other things do like 2 of those. So it was pretty good. And I thought, okay, that's really the key, be able to do this automatically and not have people that have to journal it, because anyone who's done journaling knows you can do it for a while, but if you've ever done Weight Watchers or any of these other things, people eventually drop off. So we did a 3-month field trial with 28 people, and there were 3 really key conditions. One was the full system, where you had this display with the garden, as well as this automatic activity inference on your head. There was another one where you just had the garden, but no automatic. You had to journal everything using an application. We had to have an application because, the AI is going to miss things, or it's going to make a mistake. Say you were running when you were really biking, and you might have to correct it. So we already had an interface for that, but you would have to go into that interface and add everything manually. And then finally there was a condition where you didn't have the background display, but you did have activity inference, but the only way to see it is if you ran that out. So you had to think about it. And so there's something about this glancing at the display when you're doing other things versus having to consciously think, hey, what am I doing today? For example, still on things like the Fitbit or these other devices, it's not showing me anything until I think, hey, what's my step count today? And only when I query it do I find out. Whereas with this, it was like you were going to be communicated over and over in a less conscious manner. And so, what do you know? In the results, we ran this study. At the time, we thought a horrible time to run an exercise study. It started just about now, right before Thanksgiving, ran through the winter holidays, through into January and early February in Seattle. Okay, and a lot of prior research shows that people drop off on the research at the time of year, and you can guess why. It gets dark, it gets cold, it gets wet. The holidays throw people off from their routines. And what do you know, the people in the conditions who had the ambient display were able to maintain their exercise, and the people who didn't fell off. So I think, although I still think automatic inference is important, because for long-term effects, if we did this even longer, I think self-journaling gets hard. But the ambient display is still key, and I think this is something we haven't really seen yet in the industry. I have another one that try to combines both environmental sensing as well as physical activity. This one we did at Microsoft called Obesity. It's more about telling a story, and although we designed this, we didn't build it, so I won't give you the results there. And what I'm going to end with is one right here that Jessica Clochard, who's a postdoctoral researcher sitting up here, is working with me here at Stanford. We're trying to see, can we communicate some of these similar things without even a visual display, but with a vibrotactile display? So for example, if you have one of these new smart watches, could we vibrate simple patterns during the day that you could actually perceive as, let's say, a number of 1 to 10 to know how many thousand steps you need to go or something like this? And we've already run one lab study where it showed people can perceive these patterns fairly well. And next is really to see, can we do it really in your daily life while you're doing other things, and is it too disruptive or not? And so what I'm going to leave you with is one last ambient display. This is more of a vision that students from China who came to Seattle and worked with students from the US for 3 months trying to look at how do we use feedback and behavior change, made a video about an ambient display that they imagine that we can't yet build, but they thought could be the future. So I mean, that video was a little fun, but it was the basic idea of trying to say, can we use an ambient display as a way to encourage people to find different small points to do exercise in the day, which other research has shown might be a better way to change people's fitness. Again, you can't build that today, but in 5 years, you will have small projectors the size that can fit on your wrist and project there, or maybe you're going to project out on a wall or somewhere else. And so that was really just a concept video. Anyways, I'm a little over, so I want to thank you. And do we have time for one question? Okay.